We have come in our study of Genesis to the life of Jacob, continuing this sequence of God reclaiming creation through a family. We'll concentrate on Genesis 27 through 35. Here's a reminder of where the Jacob stories locate themselves relative to his grandfather Abraham, his father Isaac, and one of his sons, Joseph. The next two slides will bullet the topics that we'll walk through as we go a little more deeply in this lecture. So in a moment, we'll return to the first one, the birth promise to Rebekah, and that will be followed by exploring Esau as he despises his birthright. Next, Jacob will be obtaining the father's blessing, and then he will need to flee to Mesopotamia. Jacob thereupon will return to face Esau, whom he has fled from. Two of his sons, two brothers, will vindicate the rape of their sister, Dinah, and the Jacob material closes as he reconsecrates himself and his family to God at Bethel. This genealogical slide gives us a chance to locate Jacob visually relative to others of his relatives. Here you see Jacob, his father Isaac, his mother Rebekah, his twin brother Esau. Jacob will marry sisters Rachel and Leah, and they are daughters of Laban, who, back the line, was a relative of Abraham and of Sarah. Rachel will bring with her her servant Bilhah, or handmaiden. Leah will bring her handmaiden, or servant Zilpah. So let's begin by exploring briefly the birth promise that God gave to Rebekah concerning Jacob and Esau. There in chapter 25, we discover that Rebekah is barren. We encounter this theme of barrenness, just as her mother-in-law, Sarah, was barren. Rebekah, wife of Isaac, is initially barren. Then Isaac prays for her, and they're rewarded with a child. Here in verse 23 of Genesis 25, we find the promise or prophecy that the Lord gave to Rebekah even before her twin sons were born. 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other. And then we notice particularly the elder shall serve the younger. The elder is Esau by a short period of time. Subsequently, she gave birth to Esau's twin, Jacob. The younger, Jacob, would be the leader, and the elder, Esau, would serve him. Jacob's name, as you may recall, has the connotation of one who grasps the heel of another. And this came to be a nickname, his regular name, but it served as something of a nickname reminder for a character trait that's associated with him tricking other people or tripping them up. This particular promise that the younger would be in charge and the elder would serve the younger then undermines the cultural practice of primogeniture. Primogeniture is where the older is the leader among the offspring, the firstborn son. That's overturned here through God's prophecy. Theologically, we find in this single episode a miraculous birth and God indicating how these family members' lives will play out. So those are some literary, historical, and theological features arising just from this episode. We'll look through those same 3 lenses, literary, historical, and theological, in the successive slides as well. Right now, I'd like us to focus on Esau's attitude towards the birthright that was his as firstborn. This comes from Genesis 27. We see here that Esau despised his birthright. He did not value something that was of great value. As we read the stories of some of the later members of this family, we'll see there as well that birthright can be lost. Reuben is the oldest of Jacob's sons, and yet he disqualifies himself through immoral behavior. Simeon and Levi are next in line of Jacob's sons, but they do not wind up in the first place slot as far as honor and responsibility, privilege. They lose their slots as well, probably on account of their violent involvement in revenge of the rape of their sister Dinah. We're not saying they were wrong to seek to vindicate her honor, but as you may recall, the manner in which they went about it was over the top. So we observe that here with Esau, even though firstborn, that doesn't guarantee that he will retain that honor. That can be lost, and it is lost with some of his subsequent relatives as well, his nephews. In this regard, it's been observed by John Sailhammer that Esau disqualified himself. This puts a slightly different view on this episode. It wasn't simply that his younger brother Jacob caught him in a weak moment of hunger and took advantage of him. Yes, I think that's a legitimate part of that episode. But notice this. John Sailhammer, in his introduction to the Old Testament, writes, "We are left with no doubt that the writer sees in this story of Jacob's trickery, so we acknowledge it is trickery, a larger lesson that Esau, though he had the right of the firstborn, and here's the key concept, he did not value it over a small bowl of soup. Thus, when in God's plan Esau lost his birthright and consequently his blessing, no injustice was dealt to him. The narrative has shown that he did not want the birthright, and now in the words of the passage itself, he despised it." This is very significant. So perhaps the way that the writer, at least one of the ways the writer would want us to view this story is to ask the question, if God is engineering something truly unique and miraculous through the family of Abraham and his offspring, his successors, if he is entrusting to them a mission that will change the course of the human race, frankly, for eternity, then what kinds of persons will he need to be in place to help get that job done faithfully? We've already seen how he tested Abraham, thinking particularly of the near sacrifice of his son Isaac. It seems best to understand that as a case where God is saying, in view of the very high call that I've placed on your life, I need to see whether your commitment to me is 100%. And as we know, Abraham rose to the challenge. He passed the test with flying colors, and God responded in Genesis 22 with some of the richest words of affirmation and praise for a human being. So now as we come to Esau, and we discover that his birthright means nothing more to him than just a pot of stew when he's tired, it raises the question, is this a qualified candidate to carry on what God is trying to do through this family on behalf of the human race? The implicit response of the writer would be, no, Esau is not a qualified candidate. He needs to be taken out of the lineup, and Jacob takes his place instead. Now, admittedly, Jacob is not a perfect character, just as you or I are not perfect characters. But nevertheless, we see the derailing, the dismissal of Esau, perhaps in a little fuller light, as a result of John Sailhammer's observation here. Now we come to chapter 27, where Jacob edges out Esau in order to get not the birthright, but now the blessing, the father's blessing. In terms of how this is told, how the story is told, literary aspects, we are correct if we detect in the reading of this passage a certain amount of suspense. The actions of Jacob are hasty. We get the impression that he's on edge, and even the dialogue that is recorded for him is very clipped. It's very, very sparse. You get the impression that he's trying to cover himself. He doesn't want to give up his disguise, so he says as little as possible. You can see it yourself in the verses listed there for chapter 27. Something that we don't detect as fully in English as we can in Hebrew is the assonance. Actually, we do have assonance, don't we? Birthright and blessing both start with B. But listen to how they sound in Hebrew. The birthright, bechorah, and blessing, beracha. So these roll off the tongue with a lot of similarity. The place where we see these side by side comes in Esau's complaint to his father once the deception is exposed. He laments, "My birthright he," that is my brother Jacob, "took, and now he has taken my blessing." In addition to the assonance, this particular structure we can see as chiastic. So the blue words, took and taken, exchange place. The verbs exchange place with the object. First, in the first phrase, object comes first, birthright, and then verb, he took. Second phrase, the verb comes first, he has taken, and then the object, blessing. Simple reversal of order. What this does is just creates a sense of literary beauty. There is a thoughtfulness. It grips the individual, the reader, as we see this sort of turning of a phrase. Another feature of literary interest to us here in chapter 27 has to do with the reversal as we compare the blessing given to Jacob and then the blessing given to Esau. On the left, I've focused in on the blessing to Jacob. On the right, the focus is on the subsequent blessing, the leftover blessing, we might say, from Isaac to Esau. On the left, in verse 28, "May God give you the dew of heaven." On the right, in verse 39, the last line of that verse, "Your dwelling will be away from the dew of heaven above." On the left, verse 29, "May peoples serve you." On the right, verse 40, second line, "You will serve your brother." So in these ways we see that Jacob receives a rich blessing, and the leftovers given by Isaac to Esau form something of a reversal of what was given to Jacob. The last item concerning literary observations, which we might observe here in chapter 27, has to do with the tone of sheer anguish that gives us Esau's frame of mind, his emotional state, as a result of being cheated from his blessing. Notice these lines in verses 34, 36, and 38. In verse 34, this plea, a bitter cry as it's described here, "Bless me, me also, Father." And then this haunting question, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" And finally in verse 38, "Have you only one blessing, Father? Bless me, me also, Father." And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. How is it that hindsight is so crystal clear? And yet, this is part of the understanding of why Esau was disqualified. He was not able to look ahead and value what was truly worthwhile until he had put himself in a situation where it was no longer within reach. Admittedly, in this case, Jacob has taken it from him, but that decline began when Esau despised his birthright in an earlier chapter. In terms of historical observations, chapter 27 evidently takes place at Beersheba, towards the south of Canaan. This is evident from mention of Beersheba towards the end of the previous chapter, 26, and as Jacob will leave Isaac and Rebekah and make his way back towards Haran, it is Beersheba that he leaves from. That is in the beginning of chapter 28. So we deduce that it's entirely likely that this event of the Isaac blessing takes place at Beersheba. We know of Beersheba because of current residents there. but there was also an ancient site. This particular website, BibleSpaces.com, offers us an aerial view of the excavation of the ancient city of Beersheba. As I mentioned earlier, there's a town there, modern city, nearby today. Located at Beersheba is a well reaching 115 feet down to a water table. This photo was taken in the early 20th century of the well at Beersheba. Something I find intriguing here are the scorings of the rim rocks that we find helping to preserve the edge of this well. Think for a moment, why would there be these scorings, vertical scorings, etching themselves into the rock? If you deduce that this may be the result of the friction of bucket ropes let down into the well, think of it, 115 feet down, then I think you've got a good answer. We're not saying these very rocks date to the time of Isaac. We're saying, however, this is a significant well in the Beersheba area, and who knows how old it might be. On a theological level, a question. What do you think? Is a blessing binding when it is deceptively obtained? As we leave chapter 27 and span the material reaching into chapter 31, we find the following features. From a literary lens, the question of a doublet. It has to do with the fact that before Jacob departs, he is blessed again by his father Isaac. Here you see it at the outset of verse 1 of chapter 28. Then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him, "You shall not marry one of the Canaanite women," and so forth. Then he sends him off to the territory of Laban, a relative. Some might propose that there were two memories of the Jacob material, one remembering the blessing stolen, and another memory retelling it as a blessing knowledgeably and issued by his father with full awareness of who he's blessing here in 28. I don't think these need to be exclusive, but it's entirely possible that Jacob would have received one blessing deceptively, but now realizing, as Isaac realizes, that his son needs to obtain a wife unlike those that Esau is interested in. Rather, he needs to obtain a wife from the same family that he belongs to, the larger clan, just as Abraham's servant obtained such a wife for Isaac himself in Rebekah. That on that occasion, Isaac again would have blessed Jacob. Consequently, this need not be a doublet in the sense of a duplicate account, but two distinct episodes in the life of Jacob. There's a dimension of reversal going on as Jacob the deceiver encounters Laban, who then plays tricks on Jacob, particularly with regard to first marrying Leah when Jacob thinks that he's marrying Rachel. Observations of an historical sort lead us to pay attention to the instruction given by Father Isaac concerning how Jacob is to go about finding a wife. Nahum Sarna observes that it is the patriarch's prerogative to decide whom the members of his clan shall marry. And so Isaac is exercising that typical patriarch. We notice in contrast that son Esau violates this. He marries in contradiction to the instructions, the preferences of his parents by marrying local women from the Canaanite area. As to the pouring of oil on a stone, that is a ceremony that Jacob engaged in at Bethel after the dream vision situation of the ladder reaching up to heaven. Again, quoting Nahum Sarna, He writes, the anointing of the witness stone, that is, the stone present at this event, consequently it's an inanimate witness. The witness stone with oil was a symbolic act establishing a contractual bond between Jacob and God. There's widespread evidence from the ancient Near East for the use of oil in international treaty relationships and in effectuating business contacts. In Jacob's case, the anointing is connected with making of a vow, which binds him to a certain commitment. So that was a solemnizing ceremony. Another historical note gives us a bit more understanding of the assumptions regarding the plant known as a mandrake, which you'll recall in one of the episodes, sort of the tug-of-war between Leah and Rachel over their shared husband, Jacob. The mandrake was regarded as an aphrodisiac in this part of the ancient world. Even later on in the Greek culture, Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love, had the epithet Lady of the Mandrake. So that was part of the understanding in that world, and why there would have been a preference for the discovery of that plant, given that these women were frankly in a race to have more offspring. Ironically, even though Leah surrenders the mandrake, she still has children, Issachar, Zebulun, and Dinah. And even though Rachel acquires the mandrake, evidently 3 years will pass before she at last has a child. And so Sarna observes, we may infer from this, the writer is acknowledging that it is not mandrakes with some magical or chemical power, but rather it is God who has the power to enable people to conceive children or not. As far as Jacob's arrangement with Laban, that Jacob would retain the goats which show up with a pattern in their hides, a speckling or spotting, we understand that this would have been unusual. The typical goats that would be born would not have the speckling or spotting. So Jacob was ahead of time committing himself to receive only the minority. That would be the arrangement. And so what's remarkable is that God blesses him, and the genetics that typically are only the minority amount wind up producing spectacularly, and he has a phenomenal payback on this contract with Laban. As to the fact that it was at the point of year of sheep shearing that Jacob runs off with his wives, his family, it's been observed that this would have been a period of time when there was a lot of commotion. In other words, Laban would have been distracted, and Jacob could have escaped, could have made his exit unnoticed at that time, more so or more easily than at other times of the year. In chapter 31, we find that Laban is missing some household gods and accuses Jacob of having stolen them. Here's some pictures of the sorts of figurines. These are relatively small. I don't have exact measurements on these, but based on others that I've seen, I expect that what we're looking at right here are somewhere between the dimension of perhaps 4 to 6 inches tall. So these are small, they're very portable. Teraphim would call them. They're terracotta figurines. They were objects of worship, various ceremonies. As Laban and Jacob part company, Laban adds a stipulation that Jacob must not acquire any more wives, in addition to Laban's daughters, whom he has married. This prohibition is without parallel in the Bible, notes Nahum Sarna, but it is known elsewhere in the ancient Near East. A contract from Nuzi between someone named Ishwi and Wulu provided that, and here's the quote, "If Wulu takes another wife, he shall forfeit the lands and houses of Nashwi, who was his father-in-law," end quote. Sarna continues, a marriage contract stipulates plainly that, quote, Zilikushu shall not take another wife in addition to Naluha, end quote. We're simply saying that the sort of thing that Laban stipulated, putting a cap on Jacob's extent of wives, was not without parallel in the ancient Near East. Incidentally, would like to acknowledge my indebtedness to Nahum Sarna. These quotes and insights are coming from his Jewish Publication Society commentary on the book of Genesis, something I warmly commend to you. Professor Sarna was one of my professors in graduate school at Brandeis University and a remarkable individual. A few features of a theological sort that we may notice in this episode involving Jacob's movement to Mesopotamia are as follows. It is not insignificant that he of his own volition forms a covenant with God at Bethel. He is on his own. He is fleeing from his murder-minded brother Esau. And we find him responding to the vision, this dream of God who is traveling with angels, messengers up and down. He responds to that with a commitment. He evidently seems to feel that he has stumbled on a portal at this point, a portal to heaven. What may be the significance of that, we are not entirely sure, but he is aware that God is reaching out to him. He is not beyond the reach of God. God is interested in Jacob in a personal way. We notice also that the sorts of names that Leah gives are very optimistic. When her first son is born, Reuben, it means it's an announcement. See, a son. Look at this good thing that's happened to me. I have a son. The name Judah has the idea of praise. Gad has the idea of good fortune. Asher, happy. Issachar, a reward, implying God has given a reward. In contrast to this, Rachel's children and stepchildren seem to have more contentious names. Dan means vindicated. Naphtali means struggle, indicating that she is in a struggle with her sister. Joseph, may he add. In other words, may God keep on providing more children, just as I have had this one. And finally, Benjamin was originally named Ben-Oni, the son of affliction. In chapter 30, we do notice that Jacob serves as an agent of blessing to others around him. You'll recall we watched for this theme through the life of Abraham and saw it emerging from time to time. Here it is coming from Laban. He observes that Jacob is the reason that he, Laban, has prospered. And finally, we see that God fulfills his promise to protect Jacob from Laban, a promise given back at Bethel, back in that dream vision. Let's take a look at that, for it is indeed a pivotal event in the life of this patriarch. Here you see on the left, Genesis 28, beginning with verse 12. He, that is Jacob, dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. The Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring. So here's the reinforcement, the reiteration of the land promise earlier issued to Abraham and Isaac. Verse 14, your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth. So here's this great nation promise reiterated to Jacob. You shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south, and all families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Where have we heard this before? Know that I am with you. I will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised to you. The element of God's faithfulness in preserving Jacob then proves true as he makes his way back from Mesopotamia to Canaan. Jacob is very interested in this, and he reiterates that portion here in this formal agreement with God. And he says, if God will go with me and keep me in this way that I go, will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and notice this, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, and I survive this travel and then arrive back home in peace. He says, then on those conditions, I am willing for the Lord to be my God, and he pledges to give him a tenth. Now the full return of Jacob has not happened yet. That is to say, it is not until chapter 32, and the conclusion of that, that we will discover the complete fulfillment of this need to return home in peace, because in chapter 32, as you recall, he will come up against Esau, and this will be an extremely dangerous, a very threatening encounter, and proves to be a deeply, deeply transforming moment in Jacob's life. This lecture concerning Jacob in Genesis 27 through 35 will be continued in the next video.